Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to those of you here in the audience, and perhaps good morning to those of you tuning in west of us here in Toronto. My name is Anthony Quinn. I'm the president of the Canadian Association of Retired Persons, also known as CARP, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here today in conjunction with The Peak, Canada's most read financial newsletter for professionals, with whom we share this home here at the Zoomerplex. We're delighted to be able to use this space to compliments of ZoomerMedia, whose holdings include Zoomer.com, Blog.to, Daily Hive, Curiosity, Mobile Syrup, Culture, and the traditional media channels Vision TV, Classical 96.3, and AM 740, Zoomer Radio in Toronto. We're here in Zoomer Hall on the occasion of National Seniors Day. Every year in Canada on October 1st, we celebrate the contributions Canadian seniors have made to our country. Now, CARP not only wants to shine a light on seniors' past contributions, but also to the ongoing contributions and the important role that seniors play in our society. Not only have seniors built the communities that we live in today, they are the backbone of volunteerism in Canada. They continue to be an important part of our economy. Many are still in the workforce, and they are taxpayers. They are consumers, they are grandparents and babysitters, and our elders who bring the wisdom that can only be achieved over time. Now, typically on National Seniors Day, we have gathered to raise CARP flags at city halls across Canada through our local chapter network. We have held events, including a memorable Guinness Book of World Records event where we promoted vaccinations for influenza, and we endeavor to make this day a focal point of concerns on the minds of seniors in Canada. But because of rampant inflation and the pinch that Canadians are feeling at the gas station, at the grocery store, and all points in between, we wanted to talk today about financial security on this National Seniors Day, because that topic has proven to be the issue top of mind for our members, and according to national polling, it's the top issue for the majority of Canadians. And when speaking with my colleagues who are not seniors or retirees themselves, the goal for today was to have a discussion that bridges the financial strain that is happening across all generations. I was at a forum on pensions last year, and one of the points I took away from the panelists was that Canadians tend not to value their future selves. Meaning when you're in your 20s and 30s and 40s, you're quite engaged in your busy lives and not thinking about yourself in the future. It's often hard enough to deal with the immediate issues that you're facing, and we don't tend to see ourselves in our 70s, 80s, and beyond. So the message of valuing your future self is what I wanted to discuss today, to pass on to younger Canadians everything that they can do to improve their financial situation in the future, and to learn from those of our members and seniors gathered today who have gone through the wars, who have experienced inflation, who have experienced recessions and bubbles bursting. And every time that you are considering yourself today in the future, we ask you to considering yourself today in the present time, be sure you're considering yourself in the future. Planning and saving for your future can be a tough concept to grasp. We often hear from our CARP members who are struggling financially saying they wish they would have done more of this, or they wish they would have done more of that. We want to find out about some of those things that they should have been doing. In today's audience, we have older and younger Canadians and a panel of relatively younger experts. And my goal here today is to connect these generations, the younger people who are one day going to be old, and the older people who can pass on those learnings. On National Seniors Day, we recognize that these seniors have learned the hard way. That's why we've gathered generations today to talk about financial security. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here and indulging me with that introduction. I first want to introduce my colleague, Brett Chang. Brett is the co-founder of The Peak. His website is readthepeak.com. And I want to encourage you all to sign up for his newsletter. And I'm going to ask Brett just to tell us a bit about The Peak, how it started, and what you're doing now.
Hi everyone, my name is Brett Chang. I'm the co-founder of The Peak. The story behind The Peak was that about 4 years ago, we looked around at our friends and family and colleagues, and they were all getting their business news primarily from these US outlets. And there was no real good Canadian source of business news for a younger generation that would be in a format and a tone and a voice that really resonated with them. So we started at the Peak, and it's been 4 years now, and we do fast, fun Canadian business news, and we go to about 160,000 Canadian young professionals every day. But we also have a bunch of great people in our audience that are beyond that demographic, and we're excited to welcome everyone into the Peak community.
Thanks very much, Brett. And I'll go through the rest of the introductions before we get started with the discussion. I'm also delighted to have two representatives from the Ontario Securities Commission. What is the OSC, you ask? Well, I looked it up. The OSC is an independent Ontario Crown agency that regulates the province's capital markets by administering and enforcing laws like the Securities Act and Commodities Futures Act. Its main goals are to protect investors from unfair practices, foster fair and efficient capital markets, and contribute to the stability of the financial system. And because Ontario has the highest concentration of financial services in the country, the OSC does tend to reverberate across our nation. So welcome to Mira Paleja. She is the Program Head of Research and Behavioral Insights at the Ontario Securities Commission. Welcome, Mira.
Thank you.
And beside her is Matthew, I'm going to screw it up, Matthew. Onaiju. Matthew is a Senior Vice President, Registration, Inspections and Examinations at the Ontario Securities Commission. And our two other guests work in the financial services industry, but have come to our attention because of their success on financial education on the internet. A new term that I came to understand in the research was called a finfluencer, which is a financial influencer. And Richard Coffin is one of Canada's biggest financial influencers. He's an investment analyst and portfolio manager with Watson D. Primo Steele, and he has CFA and CFP designations. You can tell us what those are as part of our conversation. And Richard has branded himself as the Plain Bagel. I want to find out a bit more about what the Plain Bagel means. His YouTube channel has over 1 million subscribers and lists 225 current videos. So that's a lot of information and a lot of influence, I think, Richard. And last but not least is Ben Felix. Ben is a Chief Investment Officer and Portfolio Manager at PWL Capital. He's also a YouTube host and an expert in evidence-based investing. He has his MBA, his CFA, his CFP, his CIM, and FPI. So again, when we talk about who is investing your money, we want to find out what those designations mean. So, thank you very much, all of you, for coming to our panel today, and all of you for joining us. Looking forward to learning from you. So the first topic I wanted to cover was the question of financial security. Are Canadians feeling financially secure, and what are you hearing from your audiences across generations? So Brad, I wanted to start with you. The parliamentary budget officer was in the news last week, literally pulling his hair out at the debt and deficit that Canada is facing, saying it was completely unsustainable. Housing prices are up, or at least leveling out now. How has the Canadian economy affected your audiences?
I think when you think about the cost of living crisis, it's young people that are really bearing the brunt of that, and that's primarily driven by housing costs. It used to be the case in Canada that if you worked hard and you went to school, you got a good job after, and you could buy a house and raise a family in that. And if you look at housing prices today, that's no longer really possible unless you have some type of outside support, whether that be through family or you win the lottery. And so because of that, there's a lot of younger Canadians that just feel stuck. Like they can't take that next step in life. And that's primarily driven by housing prices, but it's accelerated by the increase in prices of everything. And that's due to inflation, that's due to tariffs. There's a bunch of contributing factors there, but young people really do feel like they're being left behind in today's economy. And I think it's great that we're having this important conversation today about what you do about that.
Maybe I'll go to Richard then. So that's perspective of younger investors or younger Canadians. What do you think the experience is for older adults who are worrying about outliving their money if they've done enough to save for their retirement, not knowing just how long that longevity will last?
Sure. I think with the older audiences and populations, you see a lot of risk around the unexpected costs and medical costs. And one thing that we were discussing earlier is the cost of senior homes and those sort of support networks, which have also increased quite a bit in costs as well. So, the younger generation, there's this frustration and concern around housing, and ironically, weirdly enough, you see the same sort of anxieties at the other side of the spectrum, but for a different purpose, for a different reason. And Canada faces shortages in terms of hospital beds and all these issues that ultimately impact senior populations disproportionately. So you see anxieties there as well, and especially when you have a population with a fixed income, where they don't have the same opportunity to bring in a new source of income or expand their income earning capabilities. That's a big risk there as well. And I think there's been a lot more discussions and anxieties in recent years about those issues. And you know, as an advisor, you see it firsthand where someone goes through that experience and the stress that it brings to them and family members as well.
Typically, our members have reported that healthcare and financial security are 1 and 2 based on what their number 1 priorities are and what they want CARP to work on. In the last few years, financial security has flipped ahead of healthcare, and it's the number 1 issue, based not only on they're worried about outliving their money, which is their number 1 concern, but inflation seems to affect older adults in a unique way because they're at the grocery stores and the fuel costs have gone up. They don't have the other basket of goods that we see in the consumer price index that we would sort of judge inflation by. They're specifically targeted. Do you think that older adults are unique, or are Canadians, younger Canadians, feeling it the same way? Maybe I'll ask Ben to weigh in on that.
I think every individual is going to have their own inflation basket. It's a little bit difficult to say whether older or younger Canadians are going to feel inflation more as a group. But I think it is very important for any individual who's planning for their future to think about their specific inflation basket based on what they consume. And that is going to be different for everybody. Statistics Canada actually has a pretty neat little calculator on their website where you can plug in what you spend your money on, and they will tell you what your personal inflation rate is. And then you can compare that to indexing on things like CPP and OAS to help plan for the future.
CARP had advocated for a specific seniors price index that sort of talked about the basket of goods that seniors were interested in, particularly around OAS and CPP indexing, so that they were bringing out the right increase that matched their real needs versus the larger CPI index. So that's great advice to see what Stats Canada has. Maybe I'll talk to our friends from the Securities Commission. What role does a securities advise or securities industry have to play in protecting Canadians on their daily lives? So while you're advocating or administering the investment professionals' activities, how does your role translate to the everyday Canadian? Maybe I'll ask Mira first.
So, I mean, what I will say is that one of the things that the OSC has been doing a lot of lately is carrying out research to help us understand the different groups and the different populations that are impacted, and essentially to drive evidence-based decision making and how we develop policies, how we develop regulation. And so one of the things that we looked at recently was the experiences of retirees versus pre-retirees. So this was work that we carried out and published in January of last year. And what we saw is that the experience of retirees and pre-retirees, so those that are 55 plus, are different in a lot of ways, suggesting that retirement is changing. So what we're seeing is that pre-retirees might be retiring less comfortably than current retirees. We see that pre-retirees might have less access to workplace pension plan, for example. We see that they're more likely to rely on selling their home as a way to fund their retirement. And we're seeing kind of patterns that are consistent across the two groups. So concerns around inflation, concerns around housing costs and rental costs. And so, you know, by doing this kind of work, we're trying to understand what's the landscape, what is the everyday person experiencing, and how can we drive policy, educational efforts, regulation to help account for all the different folks that we're dealing with.
Matthew, how has the landscape changed for our audience, for the individual investor over the last, say, several decades? I think it used to be you would just shake hands with someone and then they took care of your money going forward. That was it. So how has it changed, and how has your role as a regulator changed?
I think that's a great question, Anthony. I think that, what we've experienced is truly unprecedented rate of change in terms of the technological deployment and capabilities of the marketplace and the median for which clients interact with their investment professionals. For instance, 10 years ago, NVIDIA was a penny stock, and now it's one of the most capitalized companies in the world. We've witnessed growths of new markets entirely, such as cryptocurrencies and whatnot. And, with the pandemic, the do-it-yourself investor opportunities have increased geometrically, which creates new opportunities and risks. I think at our role at the OSC, it's to make capital markets inviting, thriving, and secure for all Ontarians and Canadians through our extension and colleagues in our work with the CSA, the Canadian Securities Administrators. And, we do thoughtful research, as Mira suggested, but we also have important oversight channels and mechanisms to continuously stay informed, perform monitoring and testing, report on deficiencies, which overall inform policy, and we'll take appropriate remedial action where we identify there's challenges.
How hard is it for a regulator to keep up with all of these changes? Because changes seem to happen, and regulators are often chasing the new things that are happening. How hard is it for a regulator to keep up with what's going on?
I think that's a great follow-up question, and I think that through our strategic plan that was announced last year, you can observe how we've recalibrated the commission to be more agile. We hire smart people like my colleague Mira, and we have a whole thought leadership division, which really emphasizes horizon scanning to stay on top of these emerging trends.
Well, I think investor education is one of the things we hope to accomplish today, and the three gentlemen here are in that business. Aside from their own job as investment advisors, they are educating Canadians. So maybe, Richard, tell us a bit about your role as an educator when it comes to the latest investment advice, or an audience finding a new place for investment advice. What's your role as an influencer, a finfluencer?
Sure. So specifically with the content I cover, and for my own area, it's really changed over time. It's gone from covering a lot of basics to now I actually cover a lot of more recent economic headlines. Tariffs have been very popular to cover on the channel, but there's the role has really been to for me and for Ben as well. There's a lot of information in the space, and not many people with traditional experience in the industry contributing to that content. And so where I have found success, and where I think Ben has found success as well, has been coming in as people who work as advisors and providing information to the space with the background and that professional perspective. And that's not to say there's great content as well from people who don't have that background. But there's actually quite a few limitations on registered advisors being able to post content from their employers. It's a big liability risk for TD Bank, for example, to have one of their advisors posting content on social media. So you just often have a veto across the entire corporation for posting any sort of content. So a lot of the content I've been posting has been trying to come from that professional background and giving that perspective while also allowing room for other perspectives in the space as well.
Well, there's obviously an appetite for that information because you have 1 million subscribers on your YouTube channel. I imagine most of them are Canadian.
A lot of US actually as well. And part of that as well is tariffs is one example, but there's plenty of US news that is covered on the channel that impacts Canada's economy. I don't have to explain that Canada's economy is very heavily tied to the US, whether we like it or not, for better or for worse, right? But when it comes to central bank decisions and securities decisions, ultimately the US market is the biggest in the world. It impacts the Canadian stock market. You have a lot of Canadian stocks that are dual listed on both exchanges for that reason. So there is also a large US audience. And for me, compared to other channels, a lot of the information I focus on is very broad and general, with the idea being to give information to that broad audience, even outside of Canada. But one of the top demographics for sure is Canadian.
And Ben, that investment advice opportunity online, if an individual investor decades ago wanted to discover this information, they would have to take the Canadian securities course. They would have to spend hours and hours and hours of research. I watched one of your 16-minute videos and I felt like I knew everything. So what is your advice to folks who watch your videos? And is that something that is actionable, or is that the kind of thing that they listen and learn and then take back to their own advisors?
I try to make every video have actionable takeaways for people so that they're not just watching it for entertainment. So they do typically have something actionable. Either you maybe should be doing this or considering this or not doing this other thing. One of the things that I try to focus on, is it okay if I use some harsh language?
Please do.
I'm citing an academic paper, if that helps. There's a huge amount of financial bullshit on the internet. And that is, there's an academic paper on financial bullshit. It's basically a language that has an indifference for the truth. So you go and look for content because it's become so easy to create content. There's tons of information that's just not very good. It can be misleading, can be not useful. In some cases, it can be harmful. So what I try to focus on my channel is combating that type of information and giving people actionable takeaways that are evidence-based and sensible that they can go put into place in their own financial plans.
And is there a concern, I'll jump ahead to a question I had for later, but is there a concern on the Security Commission side that who is giving advice and how are they regulated if they're on the internet and there's a lot of opportunity for bullshit? What's the role of what's the role of the commission?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and we do perform monitoring on influencers as they're described. This past June, we participated through our enforcement division in an international sweep of influencers targeting 87 of them and 9 issuers that have relationships with individuals that provide online advice. There's a concept called the business trigger in securities law. Whereby, if you are actively engaged in securities related activity, profit from it, act as an intermediary or some form of association, there's an expectation you become registered. And in which case the securities regime is applicable to you and, you're subject to false, misleading and such and so forth. But with respect to the business trigger itself, there is an exemption available. And provided that you're providing non-tailored investment advice, that's generally deemed as acceptable. I mean, even pre-influencer, representatives would be invited to BNN and, be able to speak to their experience and background and their sentiments on the overall marketplace.
And does your influence cross borders? So if Richard is talking to an American audience, what if a U.S. advisor is giving information? How do you protect Canadians from external cross-border, perhaps BS?
Yeah, well, again, a great follow-up question. See, the thing is that if you are providing advice to a demographic that is under our jurisdiction, well, then our securities regime is applicable to you. So, that could extend cross-jurisdictionally, and we do have for instance, AI chatbots, are the propriety of a U.S. entity, for instance, might be at risk of providing investment advice and unintentionally trip the business trigger. Well, that's something hypothetically that we would reach out and ensure that it's satisfying our respective requirements.
There's something just to chime in as well that's interesting on the U.S. side even, funny enough. There's been this trend recently of online creators being sponsored by publicly traded stocks. So this video is brought to you by ticker XYZ. Here's why you should invest. And what's interesting is on the US side, you actually see the opposite, where you have a lot of US creators being sponsored by Canadian companies and promoting it to their US audience. And it raises a lot of issues because some of these companies have high risks. They're very early on. Some have $0 of revenue for the past 5 years, surviving off of investor funds, and yet none of those risks are sometimes disclosed in the videos, and disclosures is kind of one of the biggest issues you see, where sometimes in the video there's no mention at all that the video is brought to you by this paid stock ticker. So it's interesting because on that conversation of jurisdiction, not only do you have to think about Canadians being influenced by US investors, but you also have the opposite where you have US investors being influenced by Canadian securities and the rules that come into play with marketing there.
So just 2 days ago on that point, there was a dynamic for which draws a lot of similarities, and the influencer was fined $40,000 by the Alberta Securities Commission. Now, in their case, as it turns, they didn't necessarily have the same form of professional acumen as my colleagues, and I believe they're both registrants, so they're bound to certain obligations.
I haven't taken one of those sponsorships too, to be clear. I haven't promoted any tickers.
But might not necessarily extend to the individual that incurred the sanction.
Brett, I hear the concern about jurisdiction and perhaps sponsored and maybe some advice that goes against regulations. But when we talk about all-out fraud and the rise of AI, my father-in-law sent me an email, and it was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau promoting this investment opportunity. He certainly wasn't promoting that investment opportunity, but someone had manipulated his image. What's the current scope of frauds and scams, and what do you see as the future of protecting yourself from these?
That's a tough question, Anthony. I don't have a lot of answers on it. We're in uncharted waters right now. The technology has gotten so good that you're able to make real lifelike videos. It gets better almost every week. They just launched a new platform called Sora today by OpenAI that does a really good job at turning really any of you into a short 30-second video that looks quite believable. I think what we have to get comfortable with is that a lot of the stuff you're going to see on the internet now is AI generated, and we need a better system to be able to decipher between what's real and what's not. That system doesn't exist yet, and I imagine that this will become such an issue that at some point the regulators will have to get involved, and there will have to be some type of verification to be able to identify whether a video was made by a real person or by artificial intelligence. And that's kind of what we need to start working through. But it's absolutely an issue, Anthony. I think a lot of people are experiencing those type of frauds right now, so we really do need to get serious about it.
In our pre-budget submission to the federal government, we covered a number of issues related to financial security, and one of them was justice for seniors that are defrauded or scammed. The example I always use is the Canadian airport. Pearson Airport had $10 million in gold stolen from the airport, and the RCMP and the provincial police and the ATF in America put all their resources into tracking down $10 million. Now, $10 million is a drop in the bucket compared to the billions of dollars in frauds that seniors or Canadians are experiencing. So what is the role of the regulator in going after those who are registrants? And do you have any extension into the judicial system to go after those who are external to registrants?
So we do, in short, and look, fraud takes up the vast majority of our colleagues' time in the enforcement division, it's something that quite often what we see is unregistered persons that are engaged in this type of activity and have circumvented the business trigger requirement that I described for registration, so they're not subject to those same sorts of protections and oversight that would otherwise occur. The enforcement division will, take appropriate action to immediately extend our resources and investigate those instances of wrongdoing. Quite recently, we've made enhancements to our disgorgement regime, where investors can actually track the monies, from the resolution of some of these files, and see what's available to them at the end of the day. I mean, it is a somber, issue. Unfortunately, these things do happen. But I'm quite confident that the Securities Commission is well positioned to continuously address this.
And Mira, is there a role for the OSC in education for investors so that they are aware of potential scams and frauds?
For sure. Our investor office inside the Ontario Securities Commission, they do a lot of really great work in educating investors. So we have we call it the GSAM website, Get Smarter About Money. So encourage everyone to check that out. That provides some really, really great resources to help Canadians understand what kind of fraud is out there, how they could potentially protect themselves. And I'll also just note on some of the research that we conducted around AI scams specifically, is in tune with what was mentioned earlier, that what we're seeing in terms of AI scams is their ability essentially to turbocharge existing scams that are already out there. And so what that means is that you can create, AI can be used to create fake identities on social media that are then putting certain investment products out there. Fake videos can be generated that people can, that look very realistic, that look legitimate. And some of our research has helped inform the kind of education strategies that we might apply. So what we saw in our work is that while AI has the ability to make conventional scams much more compelling and make it much more likely that investors will invest their money into these scams, there are strategies for mitigation. And so some of the strategies that are great to use are perhaps a step beyond traditional education approaches, because what you're doing in traditional education approaches is that you're putting a general message out there that will tell people in the event in the future when you encounter a certain kind of scam, here's what you might want to do. What the behavioral science perspective, so the kind of work that my team specializes in, what we really look at is what exactly needs to happen at the moment that somebody is presented with a potential scam. So we know that by being very specific about when you encounter the scam, knowing that you're encountering a scam, being very timely at that precise moment that's something that's happening. Those are factors that can help kind of close that gap between the traditional education efforts and what actually happens when someone is at the point of decision making. So we want to deliver very targeted, tailored interventions at the exact time that people are encountering the scam.
Well, sorry, go ahead, Matthew.
And just one other thing. The Ontario Securities Commission has also very much revamped our disruption efforts, and we're taking down thousands of fraudulent websites at this point in time. And, so I think coupled with the investor education and experience, investor alerts, websites such as the one Mira mentioned, Get Smarter About Money, and, these disruption tactics, I'd like to believe that we're making a meaningful difference.
Too often we hear from our members after they've fallen for a fraud or a scam, and they can report to the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre and they can't answer the phone because it's ringing off the hook. Based on your behavioral insights background, what is the type of thing that people should be thinking to themselves when, you mentioned the triggers, but what is the psychology behind those who are looking for that thing that's too good to be true? And they know it is, but what clicks in their head that they still go through with it? Is there something you could add to that thought I have?
Yeah, I think one very well documented feature of human psychology is this level of optimism bias that we have, where sometimes we see the statistics, we know something is risky, we know something is speculative, but for some reason we think that that doesn't apply to us, that we're gonna get really lucky. And so I think one of the things that we want to be mindful of is, as you said, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And familiarizing ourselves with the statistics and just recognizing that we're not necessarily above, what typically happens in these kinds of cases.
And we often think we are smart enough to sniff out something that's a fraud or a scam before it's too late. And they prey on that ability to convince you that you're smart enough to make the decision rather than knowing not to do it. Is there a connection there on how they're playing off people's belief in themselves?
I think that could very well be happening. I think that as people, it's kind of people evolve in their understanding of these kinds of scams, they become more resistant to them. And then what happens is the scammers also need to kind of step up their efforts. And so it's a little bit of like an evolution almost, where you might become a more sophisticated investor over time, but the scams are also increasing in sophistication. And I think that's where technology and AI presents a big risk, because AI is really enhancing these scams beyond, in many ways, what the typical investor might be prepared for at any given moment in time.
Well, a note to all of you to follow that website and find out what those latest frauds and scams are and how to protect yourself.
Can I add one thing, Anthony?
Please.
There's been a regulatory push over the last few years for clients of investment advisors to designate something called a trusted contact person. So that's someone where if the investment advisor sees something that doesn't seem quite right, they have the ability to contact the trusted contact person and say, hey, maybe it's the trusted contact person's parent or sibling. Hey, your mom or your dad is asking me to send this money over here, or they're asking to withdraw all of their investments. This just doesn't seem quite right. Can you talk to them? And so it's a really good way to have a third party involved to catch scams before they actually get executed.
I have a quick anecdote from my time when I was a chief compliance officer at a national firm. Like, such an instance truly made a meaningful difference in the outcome for one of our investors. There was one of these, international scams that you hear of, and our client was completely convinced that this was legitimate, and was very sincere and wanted to help. They were prepared to send them, the vast majority of their life savings, and we thought we need to do something here. So fortunately, that mechanism was available to us. We reached out to the adult son and daughter, and they were able to speak to what we perceived to be a senior but a vulnerable investor at that. And we had a very good outcome as a result, because they were able to successfully convince their mother that this was clearly fraudulent.
That's good news. Go ahead.
And we also saw in our research on retirees that 81% of retirees have not appointed a trusted contact person, and 73% of pre-retirees have not. And so, the common reasons for that is that they weren't necessarily asked if they would like to appoint a trusted contact person. Sometimes they're not familiar with the value of appointing one. And so there are kind of reasons why this isn't happening, but they're kind of just stem from kind of a lack of awareness or just not being provided the opportunity at the right time to make that decision.
So if this is the first time our audience have heard of this trusted person, who should they ask? Should they go to their financial advisor, to their bank? Who should they be speaking to?
Yeah, so their advisor would be the person that could help them appoint this trusted contact person. And the idea is that in a case of suspected financial exploitation or diminished mental capacity to make financial decisions, that's a resource for the financial advisor's firm to leverage. Okay.
We'll move on to our next topic, and that was related to the credentials I read after our investment advisors' names. Richard, Ben, you had 7 or 8 letters after your name. And so who is and who can give investment advice legally in Canada?
Well, so it depends. To give, as a business, to give securities advice, as the OSC folks explained earlier, you do need to be registered, technically. Although I would say that, I don't know what you think, Richard, there's a lot of content creators who are giving pretty close to tailored specific investment advice who are not regulated, so it's a little bit dicey out there. So technically, you should be registered to be giving securities advice. We do have some form of title protection in Ontario at the moment. It didn't have as much teeth as I was hoping it would. Title protection meaning to call yourself a financial planner or a financial advisor, you have to have some credentials. There are a lot of different credentials of varying quality that allow you to use those titles. So that's why I say I don't think that those regulations had as much teeth as I was originally hoping. But there are some protections for consumers there, where if someone says I'm a financial planner in Ontario, they do have to have certain Credentials, the CFP, Certified Financial Planner designation, being one of them and being the gold standard, in my opinion, for financial planning advice. But to answer your question, Anthony, it's legally, there's who can give investment advice. Who's actually doing it, I think, is a much harder question to answer.
Maybe I'll pass that to Matthew then, just to give us your role in ensuring people are regulated who are giving that advice.
Okay. So the titles protection regime that was spoken to doesn't fall within the bailiwick of the Ontario Securities Commission. That's the financial services regulator of FSRA. I got the acronym wrong, my apologies. But, it did afford some titles protection for financial advisors and financial planners. And, it's predicated on this credentialing and proficiency standard such that, there's restricted use. But I mean, really, there's thousands of titles that are currently being used. And there's different forms of financial advice at that, and not all of them require registration in the securities context. I mean, if you're speaking to estate planning or tax planning, insurance or risk mitigation, you're dealing with a whole different set of oversight regimes and expectations, which can become, I think, quite confusing for investors and, or prospective investors at that. And, how to kind of go about navigating through all this. I think with respect to securities registrable activity and, the myriad of titles that are in use, all dealing representatives, which is kind of, let's say, the non-discretionary channel for investment advice. So a lot, these tend to be the ones that are registered at the bank institutions that people have a lot of familiarity with. There are certain expectations and securities laws that require for them to act fairly good, honestly, and in good faith, perform suitability determinations. That basically is like an assessment of the product's risks, structures, features, and costs against the client profile. So there's a pairing. They have to assess a reasonable range of alternatives. They have to assess, whether there's any conflicts of interest, reconcile those, act in the best interest of clients against those standards, and coupled with which they need to put their clients' interests first when forming a recommendation. So those are general protections and expectations associated with all dealing representatives that are the non-discretionary. Then you've got my colleagues, which I believe are both portfolio managers, and their responsibility tends to go beyond that and extend into a fiduciary concept where it creates a reverse onus of potential liabilities, and it's incumbent upon them to put their clients' interests first in all aspects of the relationship. And to the extent that there's an allegation of wrongdoing, it creates that reverse onus, which maybe they could speak to.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to Richard about the fiduciary duty or the expectation that your financial advisor is working in your best interest. Now, that's not always the case. Your advisor could be working for their bosses and making sure that their bosses are getting served as well. Can you tell me what the responsibility is for advisors today?
Yeah, so just quickly, it's an old stat, so almost a decade old at this point, but I know as of 2017, only around 3% of advisors owed a fiduciary duty to their clients based on their registration. So fiduciary duty is not a very common form of registration or obligation for advisors to have. As mentioned, there is, this duty of care, meaning that the security has to be roughly appropriate you can't be selling a very aggressive growth fund to a retired senior who's very limited income, for example. That could be a form of liability on your half. But when it comes to fiduciary duty, it's not very common. And again, part of the issue as well is there's not much of a distinction. Both are advisors to the client. So clients don't have much awareness about this distinction between the two. And the other issue as well is as Ben was talking on, you have a lot of social media content and the like that really skirts that line and seems to be giving fairly specific advice of buy this stock or sell this stock. That also doesn't seemingly cause any issues or is seemingly allowed, or at least in this gray area where you don't see much crack down on that type of activity. So when it comes to fiduciary duty, it's again that idea of putting the client's interest first, having that liability if something is found to be inappropriate, and it's a more strict standard that's just not as common in the financial service industry, in part because there's a higher bar to reach. And especially when we talk about larger financial institutions, banks are one area where you have a lot of issues at times based on sales practices and the like. It can be an expensive place to bring all of your employees to based on credentialing and training and things of that sort. So you often see kind of the lowest bar being the bar that some of these institutions reach for, and that can naturally lead to a lot of issues.
I think that, if I can quickly, the big issue is the mismatch between investor expectations and reality. Whereas Richard mentioned, the majority of people using the financial planner or financial advisor title in Canada are not held to a legal fiduciary standard. They're not legally required to act in the client's best interest. But I think most clients or investors, when they go and speak to an advisor and they're looking for advice, there's an implicit assumption that advice is going to be in their best interest. So I think it's the fact that that isn't the case that's the big issue, more so than the fact that it's relatively uncommon.
I think part of that is title as well, right? Yeah. I think, again, that distinction is where you see that, like, you don't go to a Windows advisor when you go to buy new Windows, right? You go to, and you understand the rules of engagement when you go to a window contractor. You know that they have a set of windows they're going to sell you. And if you understand the rules of engagement, that's perfectly fine. But when it comes to advisors, there is that mismatch between what's being offered and what's expected to be offered.
So in our financial report to the government, our pre-budget submission, we included a new topic that we hadn't expressed in the past. We had talked about licensing of advisors and what the titles meant, but we hadn't dug in as deeply as we have to this issue. and now we're looking at a recent report that came out from the OSC and the CIRO. And I wanted to read back to you, Ben, something from one of your videos. Investigative journalism, research from Canadian regulators, and academic research all suggest that banks are more focused on selling products that are good for the bank than on giving advice in the best interest of their customers. The result is that Canadians taking advice from their banks, as many Canadians do, and my number here is 1 in 3 Canadians, are often being sold suboptimal, high-fee products by salespeople with limited experience in portfolio management and financial planning. This is a problem worth addressing. So that's our topic right now. Is I want to talk about the report that we've heard from the OSC, and tell me what you're getting to in this paragraph with your video that I watched.
Yeah, so the OSC and CIRO did just come out with a great report showing that there are concerns about the sales practices at banks, and they did a very thorough job of demonstrating why that's true. I also referenced investigative journalism. That was a big report that CBC did, which is, I think, what resulted in the OSC and CIRO doing their investigation. CBC had done, they'd gone into banks and shown that if I go and pretend to have money to invest and meet with an advisor, the advice that you tend to get is not typically great. So we have journalism, we have regulators going and investigating based on that journalism, and then there's also academic research, not specific to Canada on this topic, but there is academic research from other countries in top academic journals showing that advisors at banks are much more likely to recommend products to clients that are in the best interest of the bank, not in the best interest of the customer. And so I think you take those 3 different sources that are kind of pointing to the same thing, and it is a real issue, particularly in Canada. We talk about in Canada how strong and great our banks are, which is good, and that gives us a good financial system, and we like that. But one of the reasons that they're so strong and so profitable is because of this issue, where they're selling products that are really good for the bank to consumers, and those products are maybe not the best things for the consumers.
So
Matthew,
I think I need to respond to that one.
We quoted the OSC report in our presentation to the government, saying 25% of representatives across the banks reported that clients had been recommended products or services that are not in their best interest, at least sometimes. So that's a concern for CARP, that if you are going to an in-branch bank advisor, they might not always be acting in your best interest. So can you tell us more about that report and how it came about?
Well, firstly, maybe I'll invite Mira to kind of speak to the overall report and methodology, but just to kind of clarify some technical terms, we have not commenced investigation at this stage in the context of formal securities law definitions, but we have performed this research which identified that there was some disconcerting elements of the responses that were the opinions of the representatives. So we've not yet independently corroborated whether in fact there have been violations of securities law. That work is being done in progressing phases, which I can speak to momentarily.
So Mira, these are advisors reporting back to you through a survey or a poll?
That's right. So we conducted an anonymous survey of almost 3,000 mutual fund dealing representatives across the 5 major bank-affiliated mutual fund dealers across Ontario. And what we wanted to understand was the sales culture, environment. We wanted to understand their level of knowledge around the products that they were selling. And we also wanted to understand what range of products they have access to. And what, so this was a survey that was conducted in November and December of last year. We exceeded our sample size targets. This is a technical point, but I think an important one, that we exceeded our sample size targets for each of the 5 dealers. And what that means is that we're confident that the conclusions we're drawing is applicable across all mutual fund dealing representatives across Ontario. So I could tell you a little bit more about what we found. So as you noted, 25% of representatives reported that some products and services are recommended to clients that might not be in the client's interest. We also saw that 58% of representatives report that the use of scorecards, so this is the way that representatives track their targets, so there are kind of potentially different targets offered for different kinds of products. It's a way of them assessing how close they are in meeting their sales goals. And we found that 58% report that that's a significant source of pressure. And we found that 40% of representatives say that the scorecard it affects what products and services are recommended to clients. In terms of product offerings, what we found is that the majority of representatives report that, yes, they are only able to offer their bank's own proprietary products, but the majority are also satisfied with the product offerings they have at their disposal, although they also say it would be nice for them to be able to offer additional products. So it's a little bit, they feel positively either way. And then in terms of knowledge, what we saw is that overall, representatives were able to answer our knowledge-based questions quite accurately. The one exception to that was they did not answer as well a question relating to product fees. So 23% of representatives answered that one incorrectly. But what we are seeing overall is that this provides an additional kind of form of information that could help us in terms of our next steps and exploring to what kind of controls the dealers actually have in place to address any material conflicts of interest.
We'll talk about those next steps, but I want to ask Brett, what's the expectation, do you think, for your readers and generally folks that are going into their bank branch and seeking financial investment advice? What do you think is the expectation from the general public?
Well, most of our audience is on the younger end, and thanks to these guys in particular, I actually feel like our generation is much more educated on financial services and products than previous generations. And so now I bet if you're sitting in a bank branch, you've got younger people coming in saying, they're citing specific ETFs that they know are low fees. They've got a certain methodology in their minds about how they want to invest. And it's not necessarily picking stocks, it's identifying, which are the lowest fee products possible. And so I think that's probably what you're seeing a lot at the banks now. But unfortunately, there's a mismatch there, which is they'll go into the bank branch and whoever's advising them in that branch is going to be trying to sell them on products that might not be in their best interest, and it's only because those are the products that they have available and they're the only products that they can sell. And so this is where we need to see some type of reconciliation in terms of the information that these guys are giving, but also the ability to actually purchase those products in bank with their existing financial services providers.
Richard, what's the incentive structure in place in those branches that might be the mismatch between the client and the advisor?
Yeah, so I think it's the conflict of interest there in terms of compensation is something that has improved over time. We've had things such as the removal or rolling back of DSC fees, for example, and the implications that had. So deferred sales charges, the idea that you only pay a fee if you pay a fee if you sell the fund within a certain period of time. That ended up locking people into investments that might not be appropriate for them for a period of time, while compensating the advisor for that. We've since had that removed in Ontario, at least. I believe it's across Canada, but at least in Ontario. And when it comes to, but today we still have, with bank branch advisors, again, the main thing appears to be the sales environment and the sales pressure on these advisors to perform. So in terms of explicit conflicts, naturally there's conflicts to have clients go into certain investment funds that might pay a higher fee. So banks, again, that management expense ratio, which I believe was the specific term that a lot of people misdefined in that survey, is the percentage fee you pay that effectively compensates your advisor. And some funds will pay a more attractive MER than others. That's one factor to consider. There's
Attractive to the bank.
Attractive to the bank, sorry, for the institution, yes. And when it comes to cross-selling, that's another area that I find interesting is you can go to a bank branch advisor for investments and walk away with a credit card. Because you have financial institutions that offer all these offerings, and they're really promoting to their advisors to get your clients to not just open a TFSA, but also to open a line of credit, also to open a credit card, because that's very profitable for the institution. So it's those pressures that are really a big conflict of interest. And really, like I said, you walk into one institution, you'll get a completely different service versus when you walk into another, while these people are both called advisors. And that's really where you run into some issues.
Now, our audience typically, and I know from personal experience in talking to our members, that they can be with their bank for 30, 40, 50 years or more. This is a place they are going where they trust the advice and the service they're going to get at their branches. Ben, what do you think is the expectation that the banks, that we should have on those in-branch advisors? What should they be offering to their most trusted clients?
Well, in an ideal world, the banks would have the client's best interest in mind, and they would be giving them advice that is going to help them meet their long-term goals, as opposed to advice that is going to help the bank's bottom line. That's the idealistic view. There is some evidence from the United States that in implementing a fiduciary duty, saying that you are required to act in the client's best interest, does result in lower cost product recommendations. So we could see something like that. Our banks are pretty powerful though, and I don't know if they would want to have that type of regulation in place, because it makes it harder for them to sell the products that are in the bank's best interest. I do have a couple comments on the MER, the management expense ratio, being one of the areas where bank advisors were less knowledgeable on. If you look at the data on fund performance, one of the best predictors, if not the best predictor, is fees. So the fact that that's something that bank advisors, even though it was only 23% that didn't get it, still that's a high percentage. And that does line up with CBC's reporting, where in some of their interviews, they did have advisors telling the prospective client that the fees are nothing to worry about, or they don't really matter. So I think that is a big issue. And that really is the crux of it, where banks want to sell higher fee products. Higher fee products don't tend to be great for end investors.
Just to that point, to add on to that, so I believe it's Erica Johnson is the investigative journalist who did the CBC piece. Really great and very eye-opening on that front. But it's not just inappropriate or inefficient investments. At times you're having explicitly bad advice. Mm-hmm. So you have someone coming in with credit card debt where you're paying a 20% interest rate, being told to invest money in mutual funds or GICs, which is offering generously a 4% return if you're talking about GICs. We wouldn't really see that these days. So the issue is, again, it's not just that the advice is at times inefficient or perhaps not optimal, because there's a lot of room for optimizing most people's financial situations. And if you're it's better to be crudely right than perfectly wrong. The problem is that you're having at times advice that is actually working against an individual, locking someone's funds up in a low return GIC versus putting something in a more appropriate retirement-based fund of some sort. Even if you're talking about high fees and respect and acknowledging that, it's again that issue of cross-selling and someone coming in to ask for advice about debt management, walking away with investments when that might not be appropriate.
I do want to say quickly that something that I learned when I made the video that you referenced earlier. Well, I learned this two ways. My firm, PWL, we've hired people who previously worked at banks who were doing their best to give great advice. They were certified financial planners. They were doing a good job for their clients. They were more the exception than the rule at the bank, but they did exist. When I made that video, I heard from someone who works at one of the big banks, and they were personally offended because they're like, I'm not doing any of that stuff. I am a certified financial planner. I am giving good advice. So they are out there.
I think it's important not to lean too heavily into anecdote. I mean, at this point in time, we have some observations and reported instances, that are frankly concerning. And, we intend to undertake an examination, a formal review of all elements of sales practices, conflicts of interest, the disclosure that's in place, the controls, the training in order to assess compliance with securities laws. The vast majority of Canadians access their financial advice through these channels. And, I think that it might be just a little bit too early to signal to the alarm that this is inherently not acting in their best interest, which is in fact incongruent with securities law expectations. And we've had conversations with the management of these institutions, and they seem to have signaled commitment that they're very much attentive to the concerns that have been raised, and are working through us through these issues with us.
Well, timing-wise, everyone's investment horizon is different, and if these proposed issues or these identified issues continue and the banks are considering perhaps tackling it at some future date, when does the regulator look to start regulating? Is it a conversation between the regulators and the banks to, over time, address these issues that you flagged, or is there a demand from the regulators to take action?
Well, there's an evidence-based system that commences with, there's a provision within the Securities Act that's called, essentially authorizes a compliance examination. So we've taken those actions. And then so there's an exchange of artifacts and materials and interviews that is currently underway. And the teams will respectively assess compliance with securities law. Then it becomes a very, formal legal process, as you probably imagine, where a report will be issued to these institutions that, may identify instances where the requirements were not achieved. To the extent that the responses to those findings are inappropriately addressed, there's escalation channels available.
I do have a question. So under securities law, if bank advisors are giving advice that is suitable, but not necessarily in the client's best interest, would that be within the law?
So, not to get overly technical, but I'll do my best. So our concept within our national instruments is with respect to that very question, not akin to Reg BI out of the United States. It's put your client's interest first, recognizing that there could conceivably be more than one best investment product for them at a given point in time. So that's kind of the standard, but it provides for a wider range of opportunities, compared with a singular best option.
Yeah, okay, makes sense.
Is there a discrepancy between lower wealth investors who are typically going to their branches and asking for, take care of this windfall that I have. I've downsized my home. I've got $100,000 in liquidity. You're my trusted bank advisor. Please invest it for me. Versus someone who went to the same bank wealth division across the street, and they might have access to much more inclusive products and different products than the person in the in-branch. Is there a requirement that the banks should be treating all of their clients the same and helping them to get ahead equally?
Well, I mean, institutions are allowed to segment, and I would suspect my colleagues likely do segmentation as well. There's a certain cost associated with the provision of investment advice, and those costs are accounted for through the services that are ultimately offered. So like in my own experience in working through these institutions, it wouldn't be uncommon for segmentation to occur, and I don't necessarily think that that's inappropriate.
Segmentation being defined as you get what you pay for, is that, or if you are have a lower financial literacy, are you getting the same service at a branch as you would at a wealth division? That's my question. Maybe one of the other guys wants to answer it.
Yeah, so I think a lot to the point being made with financial institutions, and you see this with banks as well, they have their own different service lines where and it tends to be the assets you have under management is the key definer of the type of service you get. So the type of service you can get with $10,000 of investing is very different from the types of the access you have if you have $1 million portfolio. And the banks recognize that. They recognize that the client with a $1 million portfolio is going to eventually demand lower fees or better service, and they don't want to lose that very profitable client. So they tend to promote them to the higher private wealth management options within their own firm. But it is a bit of a math issue in the sense that it's hard to provide financial service for smaller books of business because the fee has to be paid somewhere, and that's why you see the entry-level mutual funds charging such a high management expense ratio is because for a $10,000 portfolio, you're going to need to charge a higher percentage to compensate for the advice. So part of it is just that intrinsic aspect that is hard to really work around, but there is also part of that is it leads to this issue where you do have beginners and people who could benefit the most from high quality financial advice do tend to get the entry level types of advisors and things of that sort. And I agree with Ben that there's a lot of great bank advisors out there. There's a lot of people who are passionate about the field. That's why they're in the field. But the truth is that especially bank branch level advisors in those entry level positions, they aren't paid much more than a retail associate at a shopping center. So when you think about the effort that goes into getting this type of job, people who are getting that type of payment aren't going to commit to these years and years of study and years of professional development for this sort of entry-level position, and that plays into a bit of the training involved with it. Banks are doing a better job of trying to bring the education as part of the role, where when you get a job at these banks, they enroll you in these courses and help pay for part of that pathway. But that's an issue you face as well, is just the finances of the operation.
And that's your pathway that you manage, Matthew.
Well, I think that these aren't homogenous groups either. Like at one of the institutions that was under review, the title that's associated with the most volume of sales is financial planners, and they're paid quite well. And that's one of the protected titles that Ben noted earlier as well. They've got a certain degree of kind of professional acumen and proficiency associated with that, likely probably have more tenure. But that's one instance of many. And it's something that we're homing into in the course of our overall sales practice review work that continues.
So that one institution is known within the industry as having a really high bar for financial planners, and that role within that institution is much more coveted than it is at other banks. So it would be great to see more of that, but as far as I know, they are the exception rather than the rule. That's not how it's happening at most.
Mira, what do you think we can see coming forth from the OSC in the future? When do you move from surveying to regulating?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, our team's work is really focused on kind of generating the insights that would be used to inform next steps, and then we kind of leave it up to our colleagues to decide. It gives kind of a starting point to the rest of the organization for here are the things we might want to take a closer look at, and those are kind of acting as cues rather than just kind of going on a hunch or anecdotal observations like what we should review. I think it kind of gives us a starting point. I don't know if Matthew, if you have something to add.
Yeah, these are complex issues, and the volume of materials that we need to review is extensive. This is going to take some time to ultimately work through. The work is actively underway, but unlike most legal processes, it can take some time to get through.
Brett, CARP is an advocacy group. We talk to government looking for them to move policies through and give them sort of the political impetus to make the changes that our members are looking for. What do you think CARP or your readers could do by way of a role of advocacy to encourage the policymakers to sort of redefine that sales aspect of investment advice to really being in the best interest of their clients?
Well, I'm no expert in this, Anthony, but I will, based on this really interesting conversation, I've taken a few things away. The OSC and the regulators, they regulate whatever the law is on the books, and that's what they're confined to, and they do a good job at that. When I take a step back and I look at the problem, which is, I'll quote Charlie Munger here, which is show me your incentives and I'll show you the outcomes. And the incentive of these advisors is to sell you high fee products. That just is it, because that's how they're going to make more money personally. That's how they're going to enrich themselves and their institution. That seems to me like a big problem. And I understand that the regulations on the books right now, I'm sure, are very technical and very complicated. I can't even pretend like I understand them. But that problem to me actually seems quite simple, which is how do you develop a fairer system which ensures that the financial institutions in which many Canadians trust and believe is acting in their best interest, how do you make sure that they're going to give them that level of service? And what can you do to make that happen? Again, I'm no expert at this, and so I don't have all the answers, but that seems to me like a pretty basic problem that it really is worth solving. And when we talk about the generational divide here, and kind of not divide, but also meeting point, and this is affecting both sides. If you're an older Canadian, you're living on a fixed income and these fees are high and they're eating into that fixed income. If you're a younger Canadian, you've got a lot of time to go, and those fees, if compounded properly, if you could remove those fees or lower those fees, compounded over time, could really make a huge difference when it comes time for them to retire. So it is truly a multi-generational issue, and one that I think should be a uniter among all generations.
Richard, what do you think some next steps could be if you were in the regulatory side yourself?
If I had all the power to make the changes. I think, again, the title protection is a big aspect where I think if people understand the professional that they're approaching, their incentives, what they're able to sell, if there's more disclosure and more transparency in terms of how those roles differ, I think that's one easy win. Because I think there's too much confusion in terms of what the differences are. And like I mentioned, when you go to I'm going to switch my analogy to doors for some reason, but if you go to someone who sells doors, you understand the incentives. They're going to sell you their doors, they're not going to sell you the neighbor, the competition's door model, even if it's a better one. I think if you set that same expectation with education, transparency, disclosures, and importantly, those name differences, I think that helps quite a bit.
Ben, any last thoughts on this topic?
I think it's a really hard economic issue. Richard alluded to this, but professionals who are able to provide really good financial advice command high salaries. Our firm employs a lot of them. I know how much we pay them. You make a lot more advising high net worth clients than you do working at a bank. So I think that's a major challenge, and I don't know what the solution is there, where if you want high proficiency advisors who are giving advice in the client's best interest, which currently means they're portfolio managers, the economics of working in a bank dealing with investors with some smaller amounts, it doesn't work. So I don't know what the solution is there, but I know that is one of the major challenges of saying, if we had a magic wand, let's just fix this issue. It's not that easy.
And just to jump on that, I think one trend, going back a bit to the finfluencer discussion, but one trend we're seeing is that rise of DIY investing, because people have become aware of these issues, and there is a lot of distrust for the finance professional in Canada, but certainly within the United States, for example, where you had the 2008 financial crisis and the disdain that really made for the industry. That still exists to this day quite a bit, and you've seen this trend of DIY, but part of that is that the fee side of it as well. Earlier investors or smaller investors don't have access to the same quality of service as higher net worth clients. And so they see, well, I can either pay an excessive fee for maybe good advice, but there's the risks there that we've talked about, and some articles and the like that suggest otherwise, that you might run into issues, or I can go and do it myself and I can learn from online resources. So part of it as well is to maybe build a framework around that DIY side, because while you have these frameworks on the registered side, there are still plenty of issues on that side. And at times you're going to run into even worse advice if you go the DIY route.
I would say that's pretty common now, where there's the similar set of conflicts of interest is now showing itself in this space. So you mentioned individual stocks being promoted earlier, Richard, but there's also ETFs, where ETF companies are approaching content creators and saying, I'd like to sponsor your video about my ETF. And then that person's audience is hearing this glowing review of some specific investment that maybe not in their best interest, but they may buy it because they're trying to learn from a source that is not the bank.
But credit to these guys, they do offer very good advice. And I can speak to myself personally on my personal finance journey. I own one stock. It's XEQT, the BlackRock All Equities Low Fee ETF. And the only reason I need to do that was because of guys like this who talk about how it's really important to keep your fees down and the value that can accrue over time. Like all of that stuff I learned from these guys. They do a really good job at giving them advice.
I appreciate that, but it's tough. Like I did a video recently on a specific type of investment product that I've noticed is being promoted very aggressively on social media and elsewhere. And I was not met with that type of reaction. I was met with people who were really mad that I was talking poorly about this thing that they think is the greatest investment ever. I think financial product manufacturers are very good at identifying the errors that investors are making and the biases that they have, and creating products that meet those things and that are more profitable for the financial institution. And I think we're seeing a lot of that happening in different ways today, not just with individual stocks, but also with different investment products.
Well, when we talk to our members, we certainly don't want them to go DIY. We are looking for them to get the best possible advice, and whether that's in their branches or with independent financial advisors, but certainly thinking that you can become your own portfolio manager by watching a few videos, that's always a concern as well. And that can certainly lead to very negative outcomes.
I think one innovation that's happened and is increasingly popular that I think is overall positive, it's probably very positive, is fee-only financial planners. So there are people now who are not charging you to manage their investments, your investments. They're not selling you a product. You're paying them a fixed dollar amount or an hourly rate for them to do a financial plan. Whether they can make investment recommendations, that's a little grayer, I think, or maybe not gray at all. I don't think they can make investment recommendations unless they're registered. Yeah. They can talk about asset allocation though. So that is an emerging business model where people can access advice even if they don't have a large amount of assets to invest.
Matthew, something else before we wrap up this report?
Look, I think that, kind of on the two front of, the emerging trends that we're identifying, the frequency and manner in which investors are consuming investment advice is, something that very much on the horizon of the OSC, as well as our counterparts at Zero. And, I think we can expect for more in that arena in the kind of coming months and years ahead. And then, as a secondary thought, we're continuing to be involved in this issue, and we're certainly live. And I think, my colleagues rightfully identified that, there's some economic realities that I think that we need to consider. Ultimately, proportionality and balance and fairness is also important, because you can have an unintended consequence of alienating and making the cost of advice so high and so tenuous that only the super elite will have access to that. And I think that that's a risk. But what I will also say to conclude is I think it's important for investors to be engaged in their portfolios and their investments. In my experience, many investors are kind of resigned to the whole thing. They don't know what their holdings are, and they kind of have this complete deference. And I think that, increasing the involvement, accessing tools such as the one available through the OSC, Get Smarter Through Money, if you're on the more novice side, can certainly, I think, go a long way to afford some protections.
Well, your report certainly was on our minds and the headlines caught our attention. So we'd be looking forward to see where the OSC goes with helping to protect investors and making sure they're getting the best possible financial advice through those channels. I wanted to move on to our last topic, which is the intergenerational fairness and equality. Now, CARP talks about old age security and protecting old age security, and we're concerned that old age security is under threat due to Canada's financial debt and deficit issues. New NATO requirements that are going to cost billions of dollars out of the federal budget, and just how big of a flashing red light old age security is when it comes to the government looking to take care of their books. We talk about investments in RRIFs. So you invest in your RSP and it grows tax deferred. And then when it comes to turning age 71, it converts to a RIF, and all of a sudden you're taking it out according to the government schedule, not according to your own. And then the Canada Pension Plan is a third thing that we promote and talk about as being one of those stools in your financial security. So you've got your investments and your savings, and that's your businesses. But I wanted to talk about intergenerational fairness. There is a gentleman in British Columbia, Dr. Paul Kershaw, and he runs the Generation Squeeze think tank out of the UBC. And his contention is that older adults are getting ahead at the expense of younger Canadians. So Brett, I wanted to ask you a bit about what is the perception amongst younger Canadians on this concept of intergenerational financial fairness? Are the boomers to blame for everything?
Where do we start? I have to be honest with you, that is the perception. If you, like I said at the start of this panel, if you look back, there was a much clearer path to build real wealth in this country than there is now. And those challenges are primarily due to one thing and one thing only, which is housing. Housing, I imagine that many in this audience and many who are tuning in live, you own your house. You've got that asset that you've paid into for a very long time. You've likely paid off your mortgage, or you have a small one remaining, and you have that stool in your retirement available to you so that when you choose to downsize or to retire fully, you can sell that asset and use that towards your retirement. Many young people don't feel like that is even possible for them. And so they begin to now struggle with this idea about what my retirement actually looks like. It becomes at that point such a fiction that they could even retire at whatever age that they really begin to write it off. And that, I think, is where the resentment comes from, because they look at the older generations and they think to themselves, these people really do have it all. In many instances, and this is, again, not a casting judgment upon anyone here, but in many instances, when there's an opportunity to build new housing, these are the same people that are against that housing. And there seems to be a dynamic that's emerging, or a narrative that's emerging among young people, that there really is a intergenerational divide, that they are the unlucky ones, and it's becoming tougher to get ahead. And I kind of do have to agree with them on that.
Now, Ben, you've told me that you've looked at the cost of housing versus leasing or renting, and not necessarily a distinction between owning and renting these days.
Yeah, so I've done research using data from the Canadian Real Estate Association. They've got a house price index for a bunch of different cities. Also from CMHC, who produce a series of rents. I use those data and some other inputs to compare the financial outcomes of renting and owning over the last 20 years. And there's differences across cities. They looked at 12 Canadian cities. Some cities that you would expect, Vancouver has been better for owners, Victoria's been better for owners. Overall, 7 of the cities were better for renters, to my surprise, even when I did the analysis. And the remaining 5 were better for owners. Toronto, actually, over that 20-year period, was better for renters. There are a lot of assumptions built into that analysis, though. It assumes the biggest one is that a renter is saving and investing in a low-cost index fund and in a TFSA or RSP, the cash flow cost difference between renting and owning. If you go and take out a mortgage to buy a house, if you can afford a down payment, the combination of your mortgage payment, your property taxes, maintenance costs on the home, or condo fees if it's a condo, are typically going to be higher than the cash flow costs and the monthly outlay for renting a similar property. If the renter is saving, over the last 20 years, if the renter was saving and investing that difference into stocks, the financial outcome across all 12 cities was about even, if I average them out. So housing is for sure an issue. I own a home. I'm fortunate to be able to do that. I know a lot of people worry about it. I don't worry about it as much because I think renting, if people understand how to be a successful renter, is a completely viable option to housing. Homeownership is still a privilege. I own my home for reasons other than financials. I like owning a place. It hedges the cost of living in that home, meaning if the cost of living where I live goes up a lot, I'm protected from that by owning my home. I'm not going to be rent evicted. I've got 4 kids, so I want to be able to stay put in one place. That's all important, and I'm grateful to be able to own a home for those reasons. But I don't think renting gets enough credit as a housing option when we talk about this issue.
I agree with everything that Ben said in terms of the economics between renting and owning. That's just true. However, there are 2 caveats there. One, what do you do if you can't even afford to rent in a big city, which is where the employment is? And 2, like you kind of ended with, I think this is an important point, if you do want to start a family, a lot of people don't want to be in a rental unit where their landlord could decide one day that they're going to renovate the whole thing and they're going to kick you out for a bit and you got to find a new place and change schools for your kids. Practically speaking, to raise a family in a rental unit can be very challenging. And this is all anybody wants to do. They want to find a place that they can afford, settle down in, and be able to raise a family there. And that's really tough with rentals. The economics of it, you're absolutely right. It is effectively the same. If you look at the S&P 500, it's out-indexed housing in Canada. Like, for sure that's true. But housing's just different. It's not, there are, one, a lot of people that can't afford to rent at all in cities because it's just way too expensive. I think the average rent for a 1-bedroom home now in Toronto was $2,000 a month. When I first moved to downtown Toronto, and this wasn't that long ago, I'm not that old, but it was $1,200 a month. And so you can see just how much that's accelerated over time. And 2, yeah, I think people do want to raise families and they want to have homes that they can kind of stick around in.
Now, is that a building issue? Is that an immigration issue? We're not looking to put the blame on older Canadians because they invested in a home. They paid 17% mortgage rates at some point. They maintained the roof. They've done everything that the government asked them to do. And now someone wants to flip that on their head and say, you guys are greedy for having done that. Well,
now we're getting into controversial territory, Anthony. I'll just express my opinion. It's just a building issue. We could live in a country where there is housing abundance, where we have high density units throughout the city and there's enough units for everybody, including those new Canadians that we welcome to this country. The practical challenge with that is that, one, it's very difficult to build housing in Canada, and that is due to a myriad of regulations at every level of government. 2, in a lot of instances, in a lot of places where you'd want to build this type of housing, they run into challenges from neighbors that stall housing, that make it very difficult to build, and this adds on to the already huge burdens of cost that's required to build housing in a highly regulated environment. Now you've got neighbors that are opposing that, and that is what's stopping it. And Anthony, the truth of the matter is that by and large, if you go to a community consultation on new housing in really anywhere in Canada, the people that are showing up are on the older side. And that's just the fact of it. And so that is where I think the tension comes from between generations.
One factor I think worth considering as well is the type of housing being built. You see a lot of luxury condos in Toronto, for example, and over time we've seen a trend of the proportion of housing meant for first-time home buyers has decreased quite a bit. And I think part of that is that long lag between starting and actually finishing a property that we have in Canada. I mean, we're probably one of the slowest countries for building properties in terms of zoning and getting through the process. So for many developers, it's just not worth it to do that for a first-time home buyer. So you see a lot of developers, when they have a plot of land, they focus on the luxury side of it because that's how they get their return on investment. It's not worth it based on economics and based on the regulations to focus on that area that's probably needed most in the country.
So that housing issue aside, old age security is also under threat for clawbacks and for potential cuts because of that large number. How important do you think it is for younger Canadians today to see themselves in the future when OAS is intended to be there for them? So OAS is a promise from a younger generation to an older generation that if I work hard, if I pay my taxes, when I retire, there is a promise of having some sort of financial security there for me through my old age. What's perhaps through the generational lens, the point of view of old age security? Is it an entitlement that is making older Canadians fat and wealthy, or is it something that younger people should be looking forward to receiving when they retire?
I mean, it's a tough question. I think the reason you have, again, these frictions with that is that current OAS benefits are paid for by current taxpayers. So the tax revenue is covering that current workers are paying is going towards that retirement benefit. So that's where some of that friction comes from. We also have a very top-heavy demographic in Canada. We have a good bump around the 30 age group, but we also have a lot of retirees and people entering retirement. So there is that consideration that you have a lot of the working class paying for this benefit. But there's also the consideration that poverty is very costly for countries. So when you think about old age security, I believe the stat is Canadians 55 to 64, less than, or around a third, I believe, have less than $5,000 of savings, or sorry, 39% have less than $5,000 of savings. 3/4 of those Canadians have less than $100,000 of savings for retirement. Both of which, while 100,000 might sound like a lot, is quite a bit for someone, not quite a bit, I should say, rather, for someone to retire off of. So part of the old age security is to ensure that Canadians who work in the country and who pay taxes their whole life get to retirement and at least have some sort of safety net to ensure that they can cover the bills and things of that sort. So I do think it's a very important program. I think a country like Canada has to have some sort of safety net when you have these demographic issues and this savings issue. But I think people are concerned around the system of how it's funded, and those are valid concerns and anxieties that people have.
I wanted to take a moment to ask the audience if they had any questions for our panelists. We have a few minutes to get some questions, so I invite Daria to wait for her to bring the mic around to you. Tell us your name and then ask your question to the panelists. And please don't ask for financial advice for your personal. Right.
No. My name's Carol. Thank you, Anthony, and the panel. If we can just go back, not for personal investment advice, I promise, Anthony, but just I feel that there is I'm finding a lack of information or education around RIFs, and I am sort of in between. I started investing. I got in the market as soon as I started working in my 20s. I'm now in between the pre-retirement and retirement age, so not likely to get another job as much as I'd like to. So I'm going to take a RIF, but I'm going to start my RIF. But I'm looking at maybe living another 30 years, and so it's not like this whole. The way that things are governed is that if you're older, you have to save you have to put your money in very safe investments. But that's an old model, I think, that's based on people living until they're 70, right? And now people are living till 90. My dad's almost 100. And if I put my money in safe stuff, I'm not going to have enough. So RIFs, I don't know if that means that when you take a RIF, you have to go into safe investments because you don't necessarily, you're still looking long term. If you're 60 and taking out a RIF, you're still looking long term.
We've heard from financial advisors who are telling corporations are telling their financial advisors to plan for living to 100. So what's the advice here for how do you finance that longevity?
Again, can't give explicit financial advice, but in terms of the general rules, you're right in saying that when it comes to taking on risk. So when we talk about conservative investments, people usually think about bonds, and they say, well, I can't fund my retirement off of just bonds. And I think it's important to acknowledge that age is just one risk variable when figuring out someone's risk tolerance. So risk tolerance being how much you can absorb as an investor from your investments in terms of risk. And the amount of savings you have, how long you have until you need that money, so how much are you planning on withdrawing from your RIF, those are all things that factor into risk tolerance. It can be dangerous to go beyond your risk tolerance to chase returns if you say, well, I don't have enough, so I have to chase sort of high bets and things like that. But there are ways to build equity, so the stock market type of investments, into a more conservative portfolio if you do so properly. So always, I would say, reach out to an advisor about that. That would be my advice, is speak to someone who can give advice based on your unique situation. But I would say that there's a sort of rule of thumb of taking 100 and subtracting your age to find your equity weight, and I think that's too crude of a figure. I think it misrepresents the risk return opportunity people should be looking for based on their risk tolerance.
But Mira, that kind of discussion frames how people become susceptible to things that are too good to be true, when you don't know if you'll be entering the workforce again, you don't know if you're going to live the same length as your father did, God bless him. How do we, again, get back to that, making sure you're not taking way too much risk that you end up in a fraud?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things, I mean, that's obviously the big challenge is nobody knows how long they have to live, right? And so we do see like a general human tendency to weigh short-term temptations over longer-term outcomes. And so one of the things that we talk about in behavioral science space is just the research showing that, like, if you were envisioning yourself, towards it at an older age, that there are some studies that show that you're going to make better financial decisions. You're going to be less prone to temptation. You're thinking about your future self versus the wants and needs of your current self. So as much as possible to detach any kind of present temptation and to prioritize your future self and your future thinking is at least psychologically, there's some evidence to show that that's an effective strategy.
Can I add some comments quickly? I was the practitioner discussant at an academic conference last week. So an academic presented their research, and I gave my comments after reading their paper. And what that research showed, and I hope I don't upset the regulatory folks here, what that paper showed is that investors should be in 100% stock portfolios for their entire lives. Now, there are lots of considerations there. Stocks are volatile. But I think the main takeaway from that research is that when we talk about risk in investing, volatility, stuff going up and down a lot, is one way to think about risk. But the ability to meet your long-term goals, which is I think what you were getting at, is a different way to think about risk. And when you measure risk in those two different ways, you can get very different results. So this paper is not published yet. They have a very cool methodology, though, the way that they arrived at that conclusion, using a huge amount of data. I think even if we accept that research is true, that everybody should be 100% stocks for their entire life, there is a massive behavioral component where, you hear me say that and you say, great, I'm going to be 100% stocks, and the market crashes 40% tomorrow, you're not going to feel so good. And if that leads you to sell your investments, then you're going to get a bad financial outcome, not just a bad emotional one. I think the main takeaway from that research and the main line of thinking that I'm trying to convey is that when we talk about someone who's retiring and maybe still has a 30-year time horizon, the idea that safe investments, safe GICs or bonds, are actually safe may be a little bit flawed or a little bit more nuanced. And thinking about risk in multiple different ways can lead to very different conclusions about what is actually safe.
I never thought of it that way. Thanks. Another question.
Hello, my name is Mark DeMarco, and I found your presentation today absolutely fascinating. I found myself agreeing with most of the conclusions and observations made by the panel. I was in business school about 40 years ago, and I recall a study that showed that Canadians pay among the highest mutual fund fees in the world. Here we are 4 decades later, not much has changed. So we're still with the status quo. I can't accept that the younger generation is more in touch. They all come out graduating from university, self-proclaimed experts on the environment, but ask them what metrics they would use to evaluate a financial product, and they're clueless. Now, I'm so happy that we have an organization like the SEC looking after investors. You're patrolling the waters for shares, but I'm not entirely sure who's protecting the investor when it comes to mutual fund salesmen. Many, many misconceptions out there, including people from my extended family and my circle of friends. Examples, they think mutual funds are free because they don't write a check every year to the mutual fund company. I had to open their eyes and say, oh, you're paying, and it's not a trivial amount. Most people don't know what they're paying. When I show them, when you're paying 2.5% annually over a holding period of, say, 20 years, that's half the cost of your original investment. And I just find that the literacy is still very low. I would like to see the educational system ramp up. I would like to see more protections. People go to their friendly bank thinking they're getting independent advice. The truth is they're not. They're getting advice which generates the highest trailer commission for the investment rep, or a product that generates big profits for the banks. Most people don't have a clue how expensive these mutual funds are. I would like to see greater education, greater protection for mutual fund investments, because the literacy is still very low. It's pathetically low.
Let me jump in
Yes.
there. So that's
the end of my rant.
that's advocacy. Maybe Brett. So what do you think? It's been 40 years, and have attitudes changed? Are younger people paying attention to what it's costing to invest?
You know, there's always going to be. I think you're broadly right. Education is still poor around the subject matter. I'll use myself as an example because I had resources like these guys and on the internet, and then it opened my eyes to the cost associated with mutual funds in this country and what the alternatives might be, and I was able to make a better decision based off of that. So I like to think that maybe the internet has helped, but if you do a broad survey, and you can talk about that, but if you do a broad survey, you'll probably find that education is still below par, and I don't have any ideas on how to fix that. These guys will.
But Richard, you've probably got a video on that.
Yeah, probably one of the older first ones, lower quality, so I apologize if you do go looking for it, because I used to film on an iPhone. But I will say that to that point, we have seen small changes that have been improvements. So finance has become a topic in many school curriculums, whereas before it hadn't been really a topic. So we're starting to see a little bit there. And one benefit, I'm quite known for being critical of the social media landscape and the people in it, but I do think it is a net benefit when it comes to that basic introductory information. There's tremendous amounts of accessible free information online covering those topics where you can search a quick video and find hundreds of people answering the question of what is a management expense ratio, what are the fees I pay when I invest. And I think we're seeing financial literacy improve through that social media route. It comes with challenges when you get into the stock analysis and stock pick side, because that's also a very hot area that draws a lot of views. So there is risk in that area, which we talked on. But I do think we're seeing slight improvements there. And then also there are regulatory changes we saw in terms of reporting requirements with fees. So fees are now starting to be reported more clearly in the reports sent to clients. But again, it's the part of it has to be at the engagement level with the advisor in terms of clear disclosure and the like. And I wouldn't have the stats in terms of whether that's being followed through or not, but obviously if that's an issue we're seeing, I think that's where it has to be resolved.
There's some good news, Matthew?
So, yeah, I was just going to say, I think that this just re-emphasizes the fact that there needs to be an engagement, a two-way engagement with respect to your investments, your understanding of the investments that you're holding. For several years now, firms have been required to produce compensation reports, which is inclusive of the cost of the mutual funds for which the clients are holding. And we have, proposals to enhance those disclosure efforts through a total cost reporting, which is going to depict the entire associated amount of the management expense ratio that we spoke about earlier in dollar terms and what that means to clients. And I think that, hopefully those mechanics will improve the transparency.
Maybe just to expand on that a little bit, so as it stands right now, it is a requirement for financial firms to disclose to their clients how much the client is paying to the advice firm for their advice. So that was a big regulatory change. And then what is coming, is it coming or proposed?
It's coming.
What is coming is total cost reporting, where the cost of the advice and also the cost of the product have to be disclosed to the client. So as it stands right now, in your 2.5% example, I think it's 2.3% now, but in that 2.3% example, 1% of that is going to the advisor. That part is currently being disclosed to the client. The 1.3% that is going to the mutual fund company for the management of the fund is not being, it's disclosed in the fund facts, 2.3%, but that 1.3% in dollar terms is not being disclosed to the client. So with total cost reporting, the full amount that is being paid for advice and the investment product is going to be disclosed to clients, and I think that will be a step in the right direction. Financial literacy is a really challenging topic. It's something that's debated quite hotly in academic finance, where there's this question of, is financial literacy the answer? Is it buyer beware and you should know what you're buying? Or is it regulation? And the argument for financial literacy is that people should just know what they're buying and they'll be better investors no matter what. The argument against it is that if you teach someone a financial literacy class in grade 12, I mean, I took calculus in high school. I don't think I could solve a differential equation right now. I mean, it's the same kind of thing, where if somebody learns about mutual fund fees when they're in grade 12 and then they're 5 years later, 6 years later getting their first job, they might not remember all of the stuff that they learned. So that's where we say, well, maybe financial literacy isn't the total solution. We have to have regulatory intervention.
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
Well, I think you guys have summed it up perfectly there. We have folks involved in the literacy side and folks involved in making sure that the advisors are working perhaps in our best interest or as close to that as possible. But you've been very generous with your time. I'm looking at the clock, so I think we have to say goodbye. And thank you very much for your time. Panelists, please give them a round of applause. And I want to wish everyone a happy National Seniors Day, and thank you very much for everyone who tuned in online. If you haven't watched the whole event, we'll be sending this to all of our members online. You can watch it on our website, and please do take a moment to visit the OSC websites and the websites of Richard and Ben, and register for the Peak at thepeak.com. Thanks again, everyone. Thank you.